the Oakland Athletics, the A's, baseball, were underfunded relative to somebody like the New York Yankees. Maybe a third of the budget to hire their players to try to compete on the national scale. And they could not because there is no cap on spending for players in baseball. It's just about how much money you can generate. So they came up with what they call sabermetrics, which was a new way to use analytics to look at baseball players in a different light than the scouts did. And so through their analyses, they were able to hire a different type of team that could compete at a third of the cost. And they were successful at doing it, and of course that was adopted and expanded across all of baseball. More specific of what I mean by Wildfire Moneyball, or Moneyball in general, is, let me see if I got a pointer here, really, that our collective wisdom, so this generated knowledge, sometimes does not meet the challenges of the time. And that was the case with Moneyball for the Oakland Athletics. And so sometimes it's subjective and often flawed, especially as things change and develop over time. Analytics can offer new perspectives that can challenge business as usual and start things on a new path towards what may be more beneficial. So, and then I always leave with this, is that analytics are beneficial. They can lay some foundation, maybe ground us all together, but they are not a full substitute. That experiential knowledge is still really key and important, and we need to integrate the two ultimately over time. Now, I got a lot of slides for you. So enjoy the photos. Most of them are photos. I'm not going to overwhelm you with text, but it may go pretty fast, so let's try to keep up. And I really like to start with this historical perspective, focusing on fire here, not full gamut of what forestry is. But I like to bring this up because here's Sunset Magazine. You know, the forest reserves were being set up in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. Forest Service following in 1905 and being really expanded in 1910 following the Big Burn or the Great Fires of 1910, right? It was really an impetus to establish a greater workforce within the U.S. National Forest at that time. But there was a lot of debate, and this was all following, of course, a fear of a timber famine coming out of the upper Midwest, right? So the forestry practices, there was a lot of conversion to agricultural lands there and utilizing the wood, but they weren't necessarily reforesting like we do nowadays and really growing that forest back. And so there was some concern, and that really expanded this impetus to use, to get more public lands under the development of the federal government in this case so that we could have a sustainable timber supply into the future. But there was some debate here, particularly in the West, as to what to do about fire. Here we see the timber industry advocating for fire in the dry forests. They were advocating it as a protection for the wet forest timber base that they were utilizing for the economics, right? So they're debating the federal government on this, that we need to continue this light burning that was in place on the landscape at the time by the Native Americans, by the early settlers, by the miners, continued those practices. And you can see this debate through this first decade following that 1910 burn and the expansion of the public agency, the Forest Service. So it may save the lumberman's property, but it destroys forests of the future. So we can protect the private lands, but on the public lands, we're not growing the number or the amount of basal area of trees that we can, because fire would naturally exclude those. And so they went into a light burning committee, as they called it. And ultimately, so I got two things here, I'm double fisting those beers, I wish. Ultimately, and here's William Greeley himself here, they settled that this Paiute, or this Native American forestry practices with fire, was not the direction that they wanted to take at that time. Okay, and this really set the stage for transitioning from one paradigm to another on the land base here in the West, right? So this would be indicative of the Native Americans' use of fire for many, many reasons, of which I'm not going to get into full suppression, what some people may call the industrial fire complex, or just this mechanized fire suppression, very aggressive moving forward. And then we begin to build our expectations about what we can derive from the lands and how we interact with the lands off of the success of this effort, right? So, in so doing, even by 1943 here on the east side of Oregon, so this This is Harold Weaver working on the Warm Springs Reservation at the time, and working with the Confederated Tribes of the Klamath, who had a reservation at that time as well. He started to see that there were some consequences to this new paradigm being instituted, and this would be indicative of that change. They're starting to see this increased density. This was what was anticipated. This was what we can expand the amount of basal area on the public lands, in so doing so by removing fire. Again, we're thinking under the concepts of timber famine, how we're going to develop our nation in the future. So this is all logical to move this direction, but there are consequences to that. Now, let's think about a little bit of the context, at least the climatic context of all this change at the time. So here's, roughly 1910. 1910 had this high temperature spike and a relatively dry conditions, right? So average summer temperature and precipitation. And this is for Medford. I pulled this out of Medford, so it's relevant to southwestern Oregon anyway. But you see these trends really all across the West. This is indicative of what was happening at the West, right? So here we have pretty cool temperatures. Moisture was declining, but the cool temperatures were maintained. And if you look at this period, right, so at this point, we're seeing those increased densifications of the forest. We were able to successfully suppress it because if you look at these conditions, this is a far easier operational environment for firefighters to work in and be successful in than this. And they were. So we entered this period, still cool temperatures, but we entered in this really wetter, cooler period. So we were able to maintain those increased densities on the forest and public land base through this, primarily because summers were moist still. Temperatures were still relatively mild. We still received that buffer from the winter snowpacks to prevent such large fires that we see today. And of course, things have changed now. But the forest still remains as dense as it was at that time. So now we're dense forest from this period, and we're in a changing climate. It's hotter, it's drier than it used to be. Now here's the same here's that same period that I had highlighted. So we're at 1950 here, late 40s, up to about 85. This is initial attack success rate. Now, 98% is the bar that we hold most of our institutions to, their suppression institutions to. This is their metric of success. And you can see, certainly through that period of cooler, wetter time, we were very successful at suppressing fires. Never reached 100%. There was always some large fires occurring, but we were close. That began to decline somewhere in the mid-80s, and you can see where we're heading. And then these bars are acreage burned. So the large fire acreage burn in the western United States in this case. So decline in initial attack success rate as the climate was changing, and we had these changed forest environments and a lot more area burned. Now, by doing that, right, so 98% means that we're suppressing fires in January, we're suppressing fires in May, June, October, and so forth. That's where our broad success comes from. That means we are sort of preferentially selecting for the worst fires on the landscape. These are the ones that we see in the news media now. It's the 2%, the 3% that occur under conditions that firefighting is not going to be successful at, and is not, and we're seeing these conditions start to impact our landscapes. They're impacting our private timber resources, our public resources, our wildlife habitat, and our communities, all at the same time. And this is just an egregious example of the public-private interaction. And all I want to say is that this is impacting both private and public resources, much of this being northern spotted owl habitat and a lot of private industrial forest land. So things that we as a society have chosen to put value on and want to see continue into the future. And so it really is impacting everybody and all resources. But it's not just about the land anymore, it's also about our communities. And we see this over and over again every year. Again, we're sort of driving towards some of the worst fires now. There are other opportunities, and I'll talk about that in a little bit for less severe fires. And this is a global problem. Here is 2009 in Australia, what they call Black Saturday bushfires. I think 102 people died at this time. And this is just one image from that. Here's Greece in 2018, and here they are evacuating into the sea. It's run to the Aegean Sea. They didn't have time to be as orderly as what Canada was experiencing, and the folks did. They evacuated into the Aegean Sea. And of course, paradise was lost to a campfire. It's pretty significant. And you can see this is just, even though the trees are largely intact, the homes are gone in this case, which is a home ignition issue. All of this together sums up to what we call the wildfire paradox. And that is, we are seeing these negative consequences, right? And at least my wife is chuckling about this. Thanks, Karen. So we call this the wildfire paradox in that, a lot of the fire behavior we're seeing and what we're experiencing from fire is a result from our choices to move to a suppression paradigm and set different expectations for a landscape. So again, this is expectations. Logical reasons that they did this. It's not about blaming somebody. It's just the conditions at the time and the direction that we were moving in. But now, agency incentives and social pressures, because of the consequences of the fires that we're experiencing, are really facilitating a continuation of this same trajectory. That is, we're going to continue to aggressively suppress and spend more and more money and try to get there, but we're still continuing to lose the battle. So we need to start to really rethink how we look at fire and what we're going to do with fire. So I throw this up there just because, just as Terry said, there was a time when I entered the forestry profession to, I don't know, whether you want to cut trees, burn trees, be in awe by trees, climb trees, or do something. I don't know what I'm doing there. But be with the trees. Liked trees better than I liked people. There was a time when I thought that was really what I was entering into and enjoyed. And I could spend a lot of time outside. And I think it's pretty evident that that is no longer just the distribution of our profession. It is far more broader now. We are integrated heavily with society, ecology, ecosystems, economics, growing trees, and working with people. Well, there is hope, and there is change, and things are moving forward in the fire realm. We are now operating under this National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Here's their vision, right? It's to safely and effectively extinguish fire, use fire where allowable, manage our natural resources, and as a nation, in some capacity, learn to live with wildland fire. It's not going away, it's here. How are we going to begin to change our relationship with that and interact with it differently? And they set up really 3 objectives, and that is, fire-adapted communities or resilient communities. And this should include the economies, particularly natural resource economies that are so integrated in many of our communities here in Oregon, our ecosystems, as well as a safe and effective wildfire response. So the National Cohesive Strategy recognizes that these 3 components need to adapt to the new fire reality, this new normal, if you will, as we often talk about it. And we like to turn this into, in this Venn diagram, that we're really looking at 3 subsystems within a broader social ecological system. As I said, the forestry profession has broadened so much. We are no longer just operating out here in the ecological or slightly economic industries. We are integrated with social values, social perceptions, social desires, and a lot of emotion that comes with that. And that's our profession today. And we need to be cognizant of it and find ways to move forward so that we as a society collectively can find that new relationship and find a new path forward in this changing climate and changing social and ecological conditions. We can adapt homes, undoubtedly. So here you can see this fire that burned and raged, and of course, this beautiful cabin survives. So it is true that most homes are ignited by embers that are flying onto the homes. They ignite leaves or pine needles in the eaves. And so there is a responsibility by the homeowners to do their part, to come to the table. But they need to be informed of that, and I think the foresters really can bring that to them and have that conversation with them so that we can do this, because this is going to be part of the solution. It's not the entire solution, but it's going to be part of our solution. Here's another perspective. This is from this year, right? So the 2004 Cal Fire out on the Mount Here National Forest, and you can see a home here. And you can see this is a pretty well-treated portion around the landscape, and they had a fire that burned all around it. Survived, no problem. Things can be done. Communities, homes, they should be adapted and prepared for fire. Fire is much more recognized as inevitable and not something that we can push off and hope doesn't impact it. It is something that's real, and we can come to the table. And then we can, of course, do things out here in the forest as well to help that. So here's also from the Malheur National Forest. This is a restoration project, a commercial thinning that happened out on the Malheur National Forest. So they were able to log the trees that have grown in since the fire suppression paradigm really came on. This was commercially viable, and this is the condition of the forest afterwards. This, of course, is likely to have much lower fire behavior and a much easier operational environment for those firefighters that we continue to ask to put themselves in harm's way. That we put them out there on these landscapes. This is far more favorable to their success, to their safety when they're out there. And that's the condition, at least on this forest. Now this, of course, in Western Oregon would not be restoration. It would be something else. But this on the East Side Forest is very indicative of restoring the forest back to a condition that was here when we as Euro-Americans arrived. And then the adapting fire management. Now this is the piece that I really reside in. This is what I focus on, is how can we adapt wildland fire management to help contribute to solutions to the problems that we're facing today. And this again is that CAL FIRE. So this was this year. Here's the fire line that they use as this road. I'm not sure what the road number is, but all this area has burned. And you can see, of course, we had, I guess, a fire season this year that was probably more indicative of the conditions we saw consistently in the 70s and 80s, right? It rained just about every couple weeks. The temperatures were pretty mild. This was the old norm. Last year was probably the new norm, right? And, entering into fire season last year, I think I had looked at the February 17th snowpacks. All of our basins in Oregon were at 120% entering into the 2018 fire season. 2017, excuse me. And then we had Chetco Bar Fire, and of course we had Eagle Creek Fire up here. We had the hottest summer on record that year, right? So we lost that buffer from our winter snowpack on preventing some of these conditions, and we're seeing hotter and drier conditions. Sometimes we can stave those off like we did this year, just by the climatic variation that was more indicative of to how we built our expectations and got to the point where we're at today. But I think those are going to be far and few between, and all projections suggest that they are into the future. And so but we can take advantage of these opportunities. And this was a year that they actually did manage this, not under full aggressive suppression. It was still being suppressed and pushed around as best they could, but they didn't want to stop it mid-slope and put all that effort into it. They wanted to let it go up to the ridge because it was safer for the firefighters, safer operationally, and it gets more fire on the landscape. Fire has an important role to play in these solutions. It is ecologically important, particularly in dry forests, like on the Malheur National Forest. But that not just there. We see its ecological value in some of our wet forests, where it really produces the diversity in tree species that we have become accustomed to being present. It also reduces those fuels, does some of that thinning for us, and at least for the next 6 to 10 years, really reduces the probability of a fire ignition and spread out of that. And so it has a real risk reduction factor as well as an ecological role, and the benefit of restructuring this forest to some semblance. So it can serve multiple purposes, fire can, under the right conditions. But that, of course, is the challenge, is how do we get there? And so back to this concept of learning to live with fire. We love this. This is actually off the Plumas National Forest, I think, from the 80s, maybe. And they are sort of thinking about this in California much longer ago. Forest Service hates to see this floating around on their websites, but we love to use it outside of that because it is such a change for them. But what we're really trying to do is, we still need to suppress fires. it would be an absurd notion to say that we can just let fire burn all of our landscapes and move forward with that. Because we've already seen some of the consequences of what's happening when we don't choose that, but it's happening against our will as it is. So we're still going to need to suppress fires. We need to expand more of the right kind of fire, right place, right time, right reason. Sounds great. It's always right. This is always right. And foster resilience and adaptation. Of course, this is, it's lofty and easy to say, but it's far more difficult to implement. And that's what we think, from an analytics perspective, that we can begin to help disentangle some of this and move things forward. And that's what I'll try to show you here in a second. But again, at the same time as we're trying to have a paradigm or a cultural shift within our agencies, within society, the wildfire environment has become increasingly complex, just like my sort of context introduction stated. We have altered forest structures. We have an expanded expectation from our landscapes. We have an expanding wildland-urban interface and this changing climate. So not only are we trying to shift the way business is done, or business as usual is done, we're also dealing with a far more challenging environment that's forcing our hands to do that. And we're trying to find solutions to get there. And this is really, why are we talking about analytics then, specific? All right, so we need to address near and long-term wildfire risk. So expand our decision space of our fire managers. We need to give them more opportunity to do what they, as professionals, recognize is the most effective strategy moving forward. We need to improve the safety and effectiveness of our response. That is, we need to ensure that our firefighters are safe when we ask them to do what it is we are asking them to do and engage with fire. The response should be commensurate with values at risk, and of course, we really want to use our resources efficiently. We're spending billions of dollars trying to hold up this current paradigm unsuccessfully. Align land management actions with wildfire response. Seems fairly logical, but it's not aligned as well as it should be. That is, how do we choose, where do we choose to do treatments on the landscape to support fire response so that we can suppress when we need to, or we can expand fire and leverage those opportunities when those opportunities present themselves. Use more prescribed fire. Of course, restore forests, and then we really need to get to the state of shared governance in wildfire management. Stakeholder engagement, cross-jurisdictional management, and communication with stakeholders. Fire management is a black box to most of us. I was a firefighter for a fair number of years, and so I have some inside knowledge of it, but it's not readily apparent why decisions are made and what they're trying to achieve to the public or even to the rest of our public agencies, to say the least. And so we need to find a strategy to engage the public so that when we do ask our managers to do something that is professionally risky, that society supports them in those efforts. Because without doing so, those mistakes that will inevitably occur, or those negative consequences that are not forecasted do occur, that they have societal support so that they're not just hung out there to dry. Giving them incentives. And so we do have analytical tools that are being developed today. We call them Potential Control Line Atlas, Wildfire Risk Assessments, and Suppression Difficulty Index. And I will explain what these are and show you some examples of how when we integrate these three, we can achieve something different.
Welcome back to the Ponderosa Pine National Forest, where staff are working together with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team to create more proactive wildfire risk management plans. One of the challenges of spatial fire planning is identifying control locations where operations can be safer and have a higher likelihood of success. This is especially important because control opportunities often don't align with ownership boundaries. With a plan in mind ahead of time, everyone involved can be clear on the best actions to take, even in a cross-boundary fire. The science team brings several tools to the table for this effort. The basic ingredients of these tools are intuitive and designed to complement local expertise and judgment. Quantitative wildfire risk assessments, suppression difficulty index, and potential control locations that help form potential wildfire operational delineations, also known as PODs. The quantitative risk assessment uses fire modeling and expert analysis to estimate benefits and losses from fire. Suppression Difficulty Index provides an assessment of the potential hazards and opportunities for fire responders by balancing expected fire behavior with access and mobility. The Atlas of Potential Control Locations maps local conditions where fire lines have and have not been effective in the past, and provides a measure of operational opportunities and challenges for suppression. By overlaying suppression difficulty and potential control locations on a map of quantitative wildfire risk, we develop PODs that summarize risks to important values while highlighting opportunities to effectively engage fire. The science team is already deploying these tools in planning applications on National Forest System lands across the western United States, including for real-time decision support on dozens of large fires. Incident management teams use these tools to prioritize responder safety and assess suppression opportunities on fire operations. And forest managers and their neighbors, like here on the Ponderosa, use these tools to integrate fire into landscape planning, prioritize fuel treatments, and create or improve control opportunities to reduce risk to things they value. Can the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team help with assessment and response planning in your area? Contact us to find out how we can help your forest and neighbors plan for the next fire.
I won't go into the nitty-gritty statistics. Put you all to sleep. We don't want to do that. But I'm happy to outside of it. But I will tell you that the potential control locations are built off of the perimeters of fires that have occurred since 2001, right? So these are real data points on what has been successful by fire managers in the last roughly 2 decades. And then we're able to project those across the landscape and assess all the features on a landscape based on that. And it's localized, it's very localized, and then we work with managers to actually verify those. We don't just put them out there and assume that they're correct. Suppression difficulty index is really that fundamental firefighter perspective on engagement with a fire. I'd say really it was developed at initial attack, but it's relevant to large fires, which is where is it at, what's the likely fire behavior to be, and how accessible is the fire, and how mobile am I going to be on that landscape. And if it's really steep and really inaccessible landscapes deep in a wilderness, that's going to elevate suppression difficulty. If it's eroded and the fire behavior is really low, it's going to lower it. And then the quantitative wildfire risk assessment integrates 28 values that multiple stakeholders recognized were important to Pacific Northwest populace, private and public. And so we use it to inform both strategic and tactical response on fires. We currently do this. And we've done this for a lot of the state of Oregon and parts of Washington, and as well as the Southwest. And then during wildfire season, when firefighters or fire teams ask for it, we produce these tools for them so they can help with their decision making. So it sort of crosses those scales from strategy to tactics, and then we're using it to inform how we should manage our lands to help support fire management, right? So now we're supporting fire management because it's one of the most significant challenges of our time. Here it is with the PODs, potential wildfire operational delineations. This is a map of the potential control locations. The blue being high probability of use, if there was a large fire there, the red being low probability. I just pulled out those that had a greater than 0.5 probability here, and you can see it sort of forms these natural polygons. If you had a large fire of that size, that is likely the control features that they would use to catch that fire. So we can take those and overlay them on then a risk assessment. Again, red being, in this case, a little cabin community here, resources at risk. Red at higher risk, higher losses if a fire occurs, and the blue being potentially positive benefits from that fire, whether it's risk reduction, fuels reduction, or fire's ecological role in the landscape. And you can summarize all that, and you really begin to stratify your landscape. And now we can pre-plan and pre-think about what would we do with an ignition here, or even more so if we had ignitions in several of these, how you would prioritize your actions to minimize losses from fire. So this, you might want to use more fire here, you would want to suppress it, and you could allocate your resources accordingly. And that's the general basis. This, I automated, or did it myself. We sit down with the local fire staff, public, private, the state, or otherwise, and have them actually determine whether these are correct and what they would use and like to use. And so this is analytically based, but integrated with the local knowledge. And here's an example from the Tonto National Forest in the Southwest. I implemented a bunch of these pods here in the Northwest pre-season this year, but we didn't have much of a fire season, so I don't have examples from this year here in the Northwest, but you can see we do have those examples from the Southwest. Tonto National Forest, this is how they set their landscape up. They have these strange high complexity because this landscape's a mess, in part because it's full of uranium, but it's also got a community in it, and it's really steep and inaccessible. So it's just, and those are the kind of issues that firefighters face. This one was full of asbestos, and this is actually a fire perimeter that ended up being used, but firefighters were engaging with the fire while it's combusting asbestos, right? So this is the kind of things that our firefighters are interacting with and what we're trying to help them be more safe and effective at. So they did get 3 fires. This is in 2017, right after this happened. Here, I'm going to focus on this one. You can see there's a bunch of red pods. So this would be, these have a lot of values that are at risk. We do not want fire there. We're going to try to exclude and keep fire out of these red pods, most likely because there's a bunch of communities and homes in there. But in the middle here, we have this sort of middle ground, what they call restore, which is fire under the right conditions could be used. And in fact, if we could reduce the risk of fire expanding from here to here, that would be a great achievement, right? So if we can reduce fire's potential of an ignition here and spreading into those communities, that would be a good thing. And that is what they tried to do here. And they successfully managed to this predetermined strategic response pod boundary and have effectively protected the resources that are around here by doing so. So more fire actually is helping those areas that are at greatest risk. But it's not just about more fire, it's also about supporting fire suppression where it's needed. So we're stratifying the landscape again. And here we have another fire up here in one of these red pods or these high-risk pods that you'd want to protect and have really aggressive and successful suppression at. And they were able to use the pod boundary and find alternative control locations in there, similar to those that we would project on the landscape, and successfully capture this, at least at a moderate size, not such a large size. Now, that strategy and then the response that resulted, we serve these products for in situ response, and this is just an example of the Watson fire off the Fremont Wainema. And I just put this example up here to show how relevant these can be to actual fire response. And you can watch this fire spread. This was 2018. You can see some of their actions, the burnouts that they're doing, and the types of lines they're using, and ultimately where this fire resides at the end, which is pretty decent alignment with what we were able to project across the landscape, right? And so now we can daylight all of these opportunities to the public and otherwise. And then we can expand it into targeting mitigation. When you don't have a good control location, we can find our best path and best potential and then reinforce those. So now we can allocate treatments to help support fire transmitting from the public lands onto the private lands by reinforcing a line, in this case happening to be on private land, right? So we can daylight those issues, begin to highlight them, and work with our partners to get there. We can forecast difficult land management landscapes. Here's that potential control location. Again, blue are good, the red are bad. Here's suppression difficulty. Red being a really challenging landscape, blue not. And then this is the risk. So you can see the distributed homes here, and you can see a lot of old growth and spotted out habitat and timber resources being reflected. And you can forecast that this landscape was going to be challenging should there be a fire, and it was. Here's the Klondike fire and the Taylor Creek fire that was marching towards Merlin, right? So we can now see this in advance and begin to plan our efforts so that we can protect those communities and those resources. And here's a little closer look at Ashland, who butts right up against a Forest Service landscape. And you can see spots like this right here where there's no good control opportunity, the landscape is difficult, and yet there's still some high values at risk. And now we know that we can communicate and talk with that private landowner and work through GNA and other authorities to create a seamless opportunity to protect homes and other resources there. And then lastly, we can also look at, and this is private land shaded here, we can see where there's potential for fire from public to private, private to public, or either or to communities that reside out here in these that you see adjacent to that. So now we can see the full suite of partners that need to come together to begin to tackle this issue. And we can daylight it and communicate and talk and develop strategies based off of that. And so just some general concluding thoughts. We're going to have to adapt. This is a foundation for us to have a conversation to begin that, and then we can use our collective wisdom and knowledge to come to some consensus as to how we're going to address these issues. And to remember that there is a shared responsibility and co-management piece to this. It's not one or the other. It doesn't have to be conflict. It should be cohesive, and we should be working together to strive to a better future. And my kids to remind me to stop talking about fire. And I will. So thank you.
Wonderful. If we give Chris a round of applause. Wonderful. That was informative. I learned a lot in that short amount of time. But I think we'll take a moment here and we'll ask a few more pushing questions. What is the lifespan of these pods? How long can I expect this spatial map you're making to last?
Well, that's interesting. If we develop the pods, we could leave them static as is if we wanted to, but the information internal would change as treatments were happening and as fires were occurring, right? So it's going to shift the profile of risk. But risk in the context of what we're looking at here, these quantitative wildfire risk assessments have a real short horizon, right? Maybe 5 years, some people say even less. And that's because, like the example I had of the Taylor Creek fire that burned almost into Merlin. Merlin was one of the most exposed communities in Oregon. Now that it's burned adjacent to it, it is no longer one of the most exposed communities in Oregon. There might be other consequences, but it no longer has that same exposure to fire. So it changes. It's really dynamic. And these risk assessments just are, and that's inherent in
So
it.
it's changing every, let's say, couple of years. How sensitive are these pods to a change in climate or a change in fire? So Merlin can go from first to last. Are we that severe of a change? How sensitive are these kinds of maps or pods?
Merlin could go, it could happen. And in particular, I like to hope that someday we would treat maybe all around a community or have fire and prescribe fire and treatments all around it, and you would effectively reduce that risk, and it would go from first to last. It wouldn't be fully last. It's not, the complete exposure profile hasn't changed because that's only, the northwestern half of what
Right, you're
might
still
expose.
going to find
So
other
there's
areas
ignitions that can come from other sides to that as well.
And who's going to be responsible for updating this kind of a map? This seems very data intensive, time consumptive. So who's going to be managing this moving forward?
That's a good question. Right now,
Right.
at least for Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington, I do not the risk assessment, but the other pieces, the SDI and the PCL. It's pretty much on my shoulders for running the analytics. And we've got it pretty well programmed out, so it's not super time intensive, but it rests on my shoulders. The QRA was, a private organization did the actual modeling, but it was funded by the Forest Service at the regional scale. And so it's likely to be carried by the federal government for a while, but the interest is to then push that out so that it gets into the hands of others, whether it's a state agency or otherwise. And so I know that's the direction they would like to take
Right.
it.
So let's take a diverse community like Roseburg, where we have state and federal Forest Service and BLM, private large landowners, small landowners, urban. You got them all in this tight area. Whose responsibility is it to reach out to someone like yourself and say, our community's interested? Do we reach out before an event happens and say, can you help us make a map? Or do you say, oh darn, we're on fire, quick, make a map now?
The latter is how it tends to happen.
Okay, very
We're
reactionary.
still very reactionary, but the intent is that this is a pre-planning tool. As you saw, we want this to be out there, discussed, and continuously refined by all partners and stakeholders in advance of these events occurring, so that we have some sort of shared or collective knowledge of what that response is likely to be and how we want fire to interact on our landscape. So.
And the costs associated for a community, it's not an expensive thing. You're providing this sort of service, if you will. I mean, they're gonna have to spend their time and their energy meeting with you, bringing a local perspective. It's not, we would like this product, you provide it. It's very integrated. They're
Yes.
going to ask for a product, you're going to help meet their needs, answer their questions, and use their local knowledge base to strengthen your product.
Absolutely. So I do the analytics. You know, I have experience in forestry and fire, but I don't come with the objectives that we would put on a pod. I don't come with the answer. I come with some tools, and then we host workshops. And I've hosted them in many places across the state. And they've been in varying degrees integrated with partners in the local public. In the Rogue Basin, we had 90 people working on drawing these pods. So we brought in the full everybody was allowed to be at the table if they had that desire. But there are some other units that have kept it really internal, at least at the initial development, for a rollout that then would engage the broader collaborative with local stakeholders. So there's different models going on, and we don't know what the right answer is, and we're all just trying to figure that out. My role is, here's some analytics, I'm going to push for a workshop, and then we're going to listen to the local public and the local practitioners as to what is best, what their knowledge is.
And then aside from, let's say, responding to a wildfire or what we consider a natural disaster here with these pods, we can also use these pods for these preventative measures. Say I work for a private agency or a federal agency, and we have X amount of dollars in our budget. We'd like to do some prescribed treatments. This can help identify areas of best use of our money, best use of our resources.
I think that's
something we also see as another avenue.
Yes, these are initially developed for strategic wildfire response, right? Which was that sort of the pods perspective that was initially displayed in the video, and after that was how are we just going to diversify our initial response if we get an ignition, which was, you know, one step forward. But many forests and many partners view it as, well, it's even more important as a tool for planning fuels treatments, harvest treatments, so that they align with our ability to manage fire in accordance with risk. And so you could, like I said, use pod boundaries to catch fire. So if you have limited resources, maybe that's the limited amount of area you can treat, and then you're prepared at least to stop the fire at some scale. Whether it's large or could be small, it could be in the couple hundred acres if you're really in the private industrial lands. You want to keep fires small.
So it's an opportunity for communities to come together with analytics, share, communicate, and hopefully provide another new tool for helping prevent extreme disasters in these communities. We want to be safe, we want to be effective with our land management. This is a tool to help us get there.
That is absolutely
wonderful.
Correct.
All right. And with that, we're going to thank Chris again for his time, and we're going to bring back up our host.
Thank you.